to it, and I don't accept yet, but it's already a part of my experience by the time I get to this third step with my sponsor, and that's transparency. I had never been transparent with another human being probably since I was 3 or 4 years old. I don't know about before then, but I've always been keeping something of me away from any of you. Now, transparency and not practicing it, I can put some fancy words on it. My sponsor used a lot less fancy word. He called it lying. I prefer some of the fancier words, but lying seems to cover it. But unless or until I commit to this process of becoming transparent, I'm not going to get to hang with you folks, and I'm not going to get to walk this path into a new life. And the third thing is service. Now, you would think as a pastor and as a therapist, I may have been in service to others, but I discovered for me, it had never been selfless service. It had never been done without some kind of outcome in mind that, in some way, sometimes small and sometimes large, put the spotlight on me. And it was the kind of service that always had an end result of look at me. The other thing I want to begin to introduce tonight, because I believe the book introduces it, and it certainly is part of my experience, is what I call a spiritual math. And there is spiritual math to this program of ours, or to any spiritual walk, in my experience. I've heard many people when they shared said that, the first day of school, the class that where they handed out the directions for life, they had gone to the bathroom or something that hour and didn't get them, or things along those lines. Well, I believe I was in the class when they began teaching the early math lessons of life, and I was there for the addition part. I learned how to add. I had the concept of more down from a very early age, but I missed the class on subtraction. And from the third step all the way through step 9, subtraction is going to be a major thing. And I hope I can share that with you in a way that you'll understand what my experience has been. The steps, when I came in, and maybe most of you walked into the room and they've got them on the wall next to the traditions, and in some groups next to the concept. And they go from top to bottom, and they're numbered 1 through 12. And when I began this walk with you folks, I saw the steps as being a linear process. And what my experience has been since then and continues to become is that they're really not linear, they're circular. They're always, we're not doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They're circular. And after a while, those of you who have been here for a while, someone can come up to you and say, what step are you on? And you're going to say, I'm not on any. That somehow the whole mix has become a way of life. When I got to you people, well, this is the way I see the program of recovery. I'm not a guy that can use the steps to work on issues in my life. I can't use the steps to work on my anger or my lust or my pride or, my any of that stuff. And the way I've experienced it is when I drank whiskey, I never did tell whiskey where I wanted to go. I went where it took me. And my experience has been that to surrender to the path of our program it would be spiritual arrogance for me to say, here's where I want to go with the steps. Here's how I want to use. My experience is that I surrender to this way of living, and whatever it takes away from me is none of my business. Whatever that process is working on with me is none of my business. Because anywhere is going to be better than where I was or where I am. Now, one thing I've shared with y'all that I had sponsorship. I got Jerry about if I'd have known I was going to be sharing on the steps years later, I'd have kept a better calendar. I think it was the 7th or 8th day. And my manner of being sponsored was we met at least twice a week. And we would listen to 15 minutes of Joe and Charlie Big Book tapes. And then we would read together out loud whatever they had covered in that tape. Some of you that are younger, you can Google tapes. They've been gone a long time, but I think it would be the same thing as CDs. Hell, they're using something today that I haven't learned to use yet, but I'm going to have to, I guess. And then the next time, we would just read the book out loud. And when we got to a place, he would ask me questions. Did you ever feel that way? What does that mean to you? What is your experience with this? You know, when Bill talks about I'd arrived, well, he didn't have me just do Bill's story. He had me go back into my life experience. And when was that time in your life when you had arrived? You know, in Bill's story earlier, it says, I was lonely and again turned to alcohol. Well, Jerry took me into that. How's that been your experience? Gradually, things got worse. We can all identify with that one. But he had me go back to be able to look at the progression of this illness in my life. And his whole point was to get me to understand that I've got a problem. Now, I knew that a long time before I came into AA. I just didn't know what my problem was. I'd had varying points in the past when I was pretty sure this was the problem, and I'd worked myself to death trying to fix it, and it just never worked. And then finally, I found out that I can't not drink, and I was pretty sure that drinking was my problem, or at least had something to do with it. And he took me through the book, and as I've shared with you in the previous couple of weeks, my discovery was I've got the allergy of the body. I don't have it because it's listed in the book. I have it because Jerry took me in my own experience, and I had the discovery that in my case, and the illness will manifest itself differently perhaps with each of us, I had it from the first night out. That once I start to drink, I cannot guarantee with any certainty how much I'm going to drink once I get started on a run. And then he took me into the really insidious part of the first step, and that's unmanageable. And the unmanageable was not what I thought it was, the divorces and legal trouble and the IRS trouble and abandoning the children and all those things. The unmanageable was, without my permission and even without my knowledge of it, over time, I had lost the ability to become and stay comfortable in my own skin for a long period of time without alcohol. And so I came to understand that step one, the second part of it, means that I'm powerless over alcohol when I'm not drinking it. How did I know that? Jerry took me into my history, and I've had periods of physical sobriety with every reason in the world to not drink again, and always drank. And I came to understand that my problem was not alcohol, it's sobriety. I cannot stand life sober. And he took me all the way to page 44 to those two questions, or those, they're really not questions, they're just declarations. If when drinking I have little control over the amount I drink, or if when I honestly wanted to, I found I couldn't quit entirely, then I'm probably an alcoholic. And so Jerry helped me put the name to my problem as alcoholic, not as alcohol. I do not have the illness of alcohol. I have the illness of alcoholism. And there's a huge difference. And there may be controversy about this, but in my experience, alcohol treated alcoholism. It didn't cause it. And probably when we get to 6 or 7, because those will be shorter shares, I may go back to that, because 6 and 7 talk about what made sobriety so untenable for me. And then it says, I got to have a spiritual experience or I'm not going to get over it. So what I was shown and experienced is step 1 is always the problem. Lack of power. And here my whole life, I've been thinking the problem was the divorce or getting fired or my kids won't talk to me or getting caught in a lie or getting in legal, I thought those were the problems. And I've been trying to fix that stuff just like you did. I've never met one of us that did not want to live a happy life and to have the people we loved and cared about to be okay. And the harder I tried to do that, the more these problems would come up, and the harder I tried to fix them, the worse they got, the more I drank. So step 1 was and always will be for me, no matter what's going on today. And today it's not about drinking, it's about living. But when I'm faced with something that I think is a problem, it's always going to be powerlessness. The solution is always going to be power. And Bill's pretty tricky there. He knows who he's talking to. He's not really getting to the God word yet. He's talking about power greater than yourself. And he comes in the back door, for me at least, and saying that, is alcohol a power greater than you? And I could see that it was. And when I accepted that, he said, do you believe there's any power in the universe greater than alcohol? And I said, sure. And he said, good, we're on step 3. And so my experience with 1 and 2 is I never did any writing. I had another alcoholic taking me through the book into my own life experience. And the sponsor knew what was wrong with me a long time before I did. He was not waiting for me to learn that. He wanted me to experience that. And when he was satisfied that I had a basic understanding out of my experience, that step 1 means, Gary, you're going to drink again. Unless you can find a power that will stand between you and that first drink. Now, on a Thursday night, we met and we read 60 to 63. And I will throw in right quick, since I was about 10 or 11 months sober, I've been reading 60 to 63 every morning and every evening for about almost 26 years. I'd say I do that 300 days out of the year at least. And then we read it together, and he took me into my experience with what is being talked about. And then Saturday morning, we met up at Suburban, because from the very first week, Jerry got me into service. Now that's, I've told you, prayer and transparency and service. I didn't know it was service, but we went up and cleaned the bathrooms every Saturday morning. I was in my home group about 6 months before I realized we had a paid janitorial service. We did not have to go up and clean the bathrooms. That was Jerry's way of getting me involved and making me, I guess, feel like I was a part of things. And I've cleaned a hell of a lot of bathrooms since then. That may be one of the main things I miss with COVID is not being able to go with sponsees up to the club and watch them clean the bathrooms. I will admit over the years I've become more a supervisor than a worker at that job, but nonetheless. And then he said something to me. Well, are you ready to do the third step? Now, I've had him as a sponsor close to a month. I know by now when you're asked one of those questions, you're supposed to say yes. So I said, sure. I didn't know he meant right then. And he moved over to the side of the room, picked up a big book, and was getting ready to kneel on the floor. And about that time, Alan walked in the front door and said, what are y'all doing? And he said, come join us. Gary's going to take his third step. My thoughts, if you're new here, are these people, what are they doing? But they both knelt down on that floor. And I'm a real quick study. I knew they didn't expect me to bless them. They wanted me to kneel with them. And I knelt down on that floor at Suburban. Those men put their arms around me. Jerry pointed to the third step prayer, and I said it out loud. And my first experience with that was the floor at Suburban is very, very hard. And I was scared to death somebody else was going to walk in and see me kneeling on the floor with two men having their arms around me. And I got up as quick as I could. And if you're new here, what I've experienced out of that since then is the God of my understanding takes my actions a whole lot more seriously than I do. And great events have come to pass in my life, I believe, that started that morning with me being embarrassed and doing it anyway. Action is much more important than thinking about it and talking about it or understanding it. All of my understanding came after the experiences of action. I didn't understand it and didn't do it. I've taken the action and the understanding as followed. Now, in that week, another thing had happened. Now, y'all won't believe this, but in the beginning, I could barely say my name in the meeting. I just could not talk. I was pretty sure I was going to say something stupid, and I felt like an outlier, and that everybody there knew everybody, and I was kind of the new guy. But for whatever reason during that week, Jerry and I sat together until he got another new sponsee. I thought I was the most important person in his life. And about 6 weeks later, somebody took the chair next to him that was mine. But the topic that morning was step 3. It came to me, and I decided to talk tonight. And I introduced myself, and I said, well, what I think step 3 means, and Jerry leaned over and whispered, pass. Now, I've never been talked down to or berated about a sponsorship. I don't believe in that. It felt like he yelled it out loud. He didn't. He said it very politely and quietly. And I passed, and after the meeting, I'm looking at him like, what I do wrong? And he got the book out. And if you have yours, turn to page 60. And I was taught to pay attention to the squiggly writing. And right there on page 60, he had me read this little paragraph. Being convinced, and here's the squiggly writing, we were at step 3. which is that we decided to turn our will and our life over to God as we understood it. And then here's the sentence Jerry wanted me to read. Just what do we mean by that? And just what do we do? And he said, Gary, we don't need your opinion of what you think it means. We've got 3 pages of good instruction and explanation here. And so let's follow it out of the book and not put our angle or our opinion on it. And then he hit me with what the book hits each one of us with. Being convinced of what? Well, it's the ABCs. There's no way anyone is going to do recovery until they get some kind, out of their own experience, sense of being convinced that I'm an alcoholic and cannot manage my own life. And that probably no human power, not my mother, not my daughter, not my son, not my wife, not my last wife, or the one before that, or the one before that, or the one to come after this one. Not my boss, not a judge, not a bishop, probably no human power could. And I believe I had a leg up on a lot of people at this point because I had been a psych therapist. And I intuitively knew by this time that I have an illness. I don't have a weakness. I don't have a lack of willpower. I don't have a soul. And having been a therapist, I knew almost intuitively that it's not a therapeutic illness. Answer. That it is mainly a spiritual illness, and it's going to demand a spiritual answer. And we started going through this. The first requirement is that we be convinced that any life run on self-will can hardly be a success. Well, I've been being transparent about that with Jerry and not even know I was doing that. I've told him all of my life story as I understood it up to that point. And my life was anything but a success. And about this time, he had me, I don't really know what the deal was. Somebody was talking about AA history, and I was asking him some questions. And he told me, all I want you to know about history right now, you'll find in the forward to the 2nd edition. Go read that. And I was doing what he asked me to do. And I read that, and I found the line that just blew my socks off. And it's to be an experience that has been a part of my life ever since. And it's when Bill is talking about, they got these basic tenets from the Oxford group. And among those, and he lists them, but one of them is they had come to believe in and depend upon a power greater than themselves. And it came to me in that moment, I have never had a second in my life where I did not believe in God. And mine had always been a loving God, never a punishing God. However, there had never been a second in my life where I'd ever depended on God. And it's from going through this 3rd step with Jerry that I came to understand what then seemed a very subtle shift in Bill's presentation in the book. He has been introducing it to us. Gets introduced a little bit first in the doctor's opinion, but he's been moving off of alcohol as our problem. And now here in step 3, he's going to hit us straight on with self-reliance and self-will. That's been the root of all of my trouble. And I could see that a little bit at this time. I'll bet you, though I have tried to give up gambling since got sober, so I'll just say that. I'll bet you that 75 times in the 26 years I've had my current sponsor, I've called him up with a problem. It's been a her problem. It's been a financial problem. It's been a kid problem. It's been a, my God, I showed my butt to the world problem again. It's been a work problem. And 75 times what I've heard from Jerry is, Gary, your problem is on page 62. Your solution is on page 25. And many times the next thing I would hear would be a click, because there was just no more discussion. And 62 has that selfishness, self-centeredness that we think is the root of all of our trouble, driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-pity. And as I understand it today, Bill is a good writer, so that means 100 forms of fear, 100 forms of self-pity, 100 forms of self-delusion. We step on the toes of our fellows and they retaliate. And you go to page 25, and he tells me that's where the solution is, and I love the way Bill starts it off. Almost none of us liked, and every time I've had to go back and surrender to the solution, I've never liked it. The self-searching, the leveling of the pride, the confession of shortcomings, which the process requires for successful confirmation. And he's talking to us as newcomers in the beginning, and he's talking to me today as someone that's been around for 27 years. And it's the same message. We saw it really worked in others. I get to see it every day. And we had come to believe in the hopelessness and futility of life as we had been living it. Well, I haven't been quite as hopeless since then as I was when I got here, but I've had some situations, particularly around one of my children, in what I thought was a relationship that would never find healing. And I've had some money problems and other things that at the moment, I was just hopeless with it. There was nothing left for us to do but pick up the simple kit of spiritual tools laid at our feet. That's what Jerry was trying to get me into in that first time through the third step. And folks, it's what the same simple tools that you and I have today. There's never going to be another toolkit. It's the same ones. Sometimes my pride grows back so hard and so quick today, or my fear comes up so hard that I almost refuse to do it. Because it's like, here we go again. You would think by now I would have learned this. But I haven't. And thank God for sponsorship. Thank God for sponsees, because most of the time today, I don't have to call Steve and talk to him about it. One of my sponsees is calling me, and I find I'm sharing the solution with them. And when I do that, I get to hear it again, and I get to do it again. But going back to the first time through, we had a lady in our group, Nina. I loved her to death. She was one of those excited people, and she loved everybody, and she hugged everybody, and she was loud, and she loved being sober. But every time she shared, she would end with, and all you need is more God. And for me, that was like somebody running fingernails over a chalkboard. It just, more God, more God, more God. And I would think, damn it, I've tried that. But when I get into 60 to 63, I make a fantastic discovery here on page 62. I've never needed more God in my life, and I never will. I've always needed less me. If I could find some way to get me out of the way, all that's left is God, because for me, there are only two wills, my will and God's will. And God's will is, or thinking, has never got me in trouble. And so it, for me, is a constant surrender to what Bill has already mentioned a number of times: simple, but not easy. It means the destruction of self-centeredness. And then eventually, when I could begin, with permission, to read the 12 and 12, the third step in the 12 and 12, pretty powerful stuff. But he's got a line in there that just finally says what he's been hinting around about the whole time. You remember when you got here and you would hear people saying, I'm a grateful alcoholic, and you thought, yeah, like hell you are. And then I get into 12 and 12, and Bill writes, therefore, this is in step 3, therefore we who are alcoholics can consider ourselves fortunate indeed. Each of us has had his own near fatal encounter with the juggernaut. And I was fairly certain the next word would be of alcohol, and it's not. Each of us has had their own near fatal encounter with the juggernaut of self-will, and has suffered enough under its weight to be willing to look for something better. And then what I have to be reminded of, and I'll remind some people like Max and Ricky of this. He's got that next line that says, so it's by circumstance rather than by virtue that we've been driven to AA, have admitted defeat, have acquired the rudiments of faith, and now want to make a decision to turn our will and our lives over to a higher power. And that's exactly what my story is. But now I had developed the rudiments of a faith. Mine, for a long time, was what was happening in your lives. Very quickly, I got out of the debating club about God. I came to accept really quite easily and very quickly that you used to be like I am now. I believed your stories. And you weren't that way anymore. And you were sharing with me that you did these same simple actions that you're asking me to do, and they changed your life drastically. And I believed that. I came to, that was the rudiments of faith that I got started with, not with a understanding of God or an experience of God of my very own. What was happening with you was powerful evidence to me that there's something, and if it'll work for you, it just might work for me. Now, you go on through that. Step 3 is powerful. I think it's the hinge to the whole thing. I've often said when I tell my story that recovery is as simple as come all the way in, sit all the way down, and stay. But I'll tell you, for coming all the way in for me means every part of my life up into the day that I knelt on the floor at the suburban group and took the action of step 3 with those 2 men. I was finally in. I was no longer visiting AA. I had moved in and didn't even know it. Now, the sitting all the way down may be the easiest part of the program we'll talk about that the next few weeks. For me, that's 4 through 9. And the staying here is the 10, 11, and 12. Particularly the work with others and the surrender each day in my life to continue to try to live about just seeking God's will. And I don't want to come across like a guy who does that perfectly. The friends that are on here from my home group know, and I say this very seriously. A C+ is a pretty good grade for me every day. If when I do that evening review, I find I've got a passing grade, most days it's going to be somewhere in a C. I don't know anybody that's on the A honor roll in AA. I don't know anyone whose life is just perfectly selfless all the time. I love an old story of Clancy's that I heard him say early on, that he had a guy with 25 or 30 years in his home group, and he would talk and he would say, I no longer have a problem with anger. God has taken anger away from me. Clancy said that just PO'd me every time I heard it. So I was serving coffee one day and on purpose accidentally spilled a cup of coffee in his lap. And he said, you know, it was a miracle. He rediscovered anger in an instant.
Gary, you got a few more minutes.
Okay. So step 3 is not something we do one time and then go on. For me, it's a daily thing, because that actor playing the director, that's not just how I used to live my life. I still want to do that. I still have children. I've got a granddaughter. I've got friends. My God, I've got sponsees, fellow AA members. And there's a lot of people I want to get across to them how they ought to be acting. And so I've got to surrender to that third step on a daily basis. Page 61 tells me the spiritual symptoms that are going to creep in to draw me away out directly into my will and away from God's will, and that's complaining and blaming. There's just no place in my experience in a spiritual walk for complaining and blaming. And that's about individuals or politics or the country or any. Complaining and blaming, I'm right back in the middle of being right and self-will. And if I'm not surrendering to this third step on a daily basis the best I can, I'll be back there in half a second. And then we get down to the prayer itself. And of course, I haven't covered everything I would like to, but he's got another caveat there. He's got a caveat at the top of the page. So long as we stay close to, this is how it is, so long as we stay close to him and perform his work well. You know, there's always caveats there of actions I need to be trying to take on a daily basis. This is not a program of saying, here, God, I'm giving it to you. Because what in the hell does God want with my crap? I'm not turning anything over to God. I'm turning it over to the care of God. If I think God's going to do everything in my life, or you do, lock yourself in the closet, see if he slides bologna sandwiches under the door, or is he going to let you starve to death? There's action on my part that's necessary on a daily basis. I turn it over to the care of God, and I asked Jerry, what is that? And he said, well, in AA, Gary, we believe it's called the fourth step. That's going to be the next step. And we'll get into that next week. So I turned my life over with 4 through 12. And that's worked pretty good for all these years. Thank y'all for being here tonight. Let me be here.